Boston was wrapped in silence that night, heavy and full, the kind that slips between the buildings before a storm. Naomi Brooks watched the city vanish behind a glass curtain from the 23rd floor of the Whitmore Hotel. Outside, snow flurried in spirals, brushing against the windows like ghostly fingertips. Inside, the lounge glowed gold and hushed, as if the room knew not to intrude on hearts that carried too much. She sat alone, tracing the rim of her wine glass with a slender finger, her nails chipped, her lipstick faint. The world thought of her as the bright, quirky freelance artist whose illustrations lived in children's books. But Naomi had stopped drawing 3 weeks ago. The night Elijah left, he'd taken more than a suitcase and a goodbye. He'd taken the version of her that believed in permanence. And maybe she had come here tonight to escape the storm and be seen in it. That's when she noticed him. A man dressed in a dark navy suit, molded to his broad frame, was seated in the far corner near the tall windows overlooking the harbor. His wheelchair was subtle, sleek chrome lines, barely noticeable in the dim light, but the way he sat held her attention. Not slouched, not resigned, just steady, like he had nothing to prove and no one to prove it to. He didn't notice her at first. His eyes were trained on the snowfall, his jaw sharp, his expression carved from silence, until he turned, just slightly, just enough. Their eyes locked. Steel blue met deep umber brown. There was no smile, no nod, only a flicker, like recognition without memory. Something in his gaze mirrored the quiet storm inside her, and for a moment, it felt like the room shrank until it was just the two of them and the soft jazz bleeding from the ceiling. Naomi stood, almost without thinking. Each step across the lounge felt louder than it was, heels tapping softly on marble, pulse matching each one. Her voice came out low, steady when she reached him, despite the wild thrum beneath her ribs. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, gesturing toward the empty leather chair across from him. He looked at her like someone who hadn't expected company, but wasn't altogether displeased by the interruption. A beat passed before he responded, voice rich and even. "Not anymore." She sat, offering a hand that trembled just slightly. "Naomi." "Thomas," he replied, his lips curling at the edges. Not a full smile, but the kind that lingers longer in memory than something more certain. He didn't ask why she was alone. She didn't ask about the chair, and that silence between them felt more honest than any answer. Instead, they talked. About the painting above the bar, Naomi guessed the artist correctly. Thomas had once funded part of the city's changing skyline. She asked if he was in finance, and he shook his head. "Biotech," he said, taking a sip of whiskey. "Retired early." She didn't press, but she noted the way his hand stilled for a second after he said it, the way his eyes dropped for just a beat too long. Some losses don't need naming to be heard. "Was it a good day?" Naomi asked, breaking the pause. "It ended better than it started," he said, glancing at her with a weight that felt intimate and unfamiliar. "I suppose I should thank the storm." She smiled, soft and quiet. "Maybe I should too." Outside, the snow continued falling in sheets, but neither looked anymore. The world beyond the window had ceased to matter. Sometimes, the most unexpected conversations begin in silence and end in meaning. And sometimes the most critical nights of your life start with a single question. Have you ever shared a moment with a stranger that changed something in you, quietly, permanently? Tell us below. Your story might inspire someone else to believe in second chances. And if Naomi and Thomas have sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, comment, and follow our channel, Love and Twilights, for more stories where love finds its way through the quietest nights. To be continued. The conversation drifted like snow for a while, slow, quiet, and oddly comforting. Thomas didn't ask the usual things men asked on first meetings. He didn't ask if she lived nearby or what she did for a living. Instead, he asked why she preferred red wine over white and whether she thought silence was underrated. Naomi, surprised, found herself answering honestly. "I like red because it lingers," she said. "It doesn't rush to be liked." He chuckled, the sound low and textured. "Like you?" She tilted her head. "Maybe." Their drinks arrived, untouched for minutes as their words filled the space instead. He told her about the building visible just beyond the harbor glass. That one, Whitmore Biocenter. I helped design the neural lab inside. Back when I was still... He trailed off. Still everything. Naomi didn't press, but she did lean forward, hands folded, eyes gentle. "Do you miss it?" Thomas shrugged. "Some days. Not all of it. Just the certainty. The illusion of control." Naomi exhaled slowly. "I've never had that. Control. Not even the illusion. Why?" She hesitated. It had been long since she told anyone the truth, let alone someone she'd just met. "My mom passed 2 years ago. Cancer. I left my design job in Atlanta to take care of her. I thought I'd bounce back, quickly start over in Boston, and build something new. Starting over isn't as romantic as it sounds when your savings run out and your portfolio feels too quiet." She gave a small laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I guess I've been floating since." Thomas didn't interrupt, didn't offer condolences, just listened. And that, Naomi realized, was rarer than sympathy. After a pause, she added, "Tonight was supposed to be dinner with a friend. She bailed, said I've been too much lately, too tired, too lost, too heavy." He raised an eyebrow. "And yet, here you are, carrying all that with more grace than you know." That made her look at him differently. Not with curiosity, but recognition. "You speak like a man who's lost something too." He didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the edge of his glass before resting on his lap. She noticed the way his hands stilled when he spoke next. "I was in a car accident 3 years ago. A test driver fell asleep at the wheel. I was the passenger. 1 vertebra, that's all it took. I woke up and everything below my chest had gone quiet. No warnings, no negotiations." Naomi's breath caught. Not out of pity, but reverence. He continued, voice composed, but slower. "I tried to rebuild. For a while I pretended I hadn't changed. But business meetings stopped feeling like progress, and people stopped looking at me the same way. There was something in how he said it. Not bitterness or sadness, just clarity. The kind that only comes from living with a truth so long that it no longer demands to be hidden." "I'm sorry," Naomi said softly. "Don't be." "I'm not." That made her blink. "You're not?" "I lost movement," he said, not meaning. But it took me a long time to understand the difference. They fell quiet after that, but not awkwardly so. The air between them had shifted, grown fuller, warmer, wrapped in the quiet that didn't require fixing. Naomi found herself watching how he sat, upright, unmoved by the stares he probably endured elsewhere. There was something regal about him, but not in a performative way. He wasn't showing strength. He inhabited it. Outside, the snow thickened. Boston was fast disappearing under layers of white. Thomas checked his watch. "Looks like the city's going to sleep." Naomi glanced out the window. Not sure I'm ready to. Then don't. She looked at him, a slow smile forming. Is that an invitation? It's a lack of resistance. She laughed, surprised at how easy it felt. You're hard to read. Is that a problem? No, but it's a first. He tilted his head. And what does that make me? She thought for a moment. A deviation. Thomas seemed to like that answer. The jazz overhead shifted, slower now, sultry and winding like smoke. The lounge was nearly empty, except for a bartender wiping down glasses and an older couple dozing near the fireplace. Naomi hesitated, then stood. Dance with me. Thomas looked up, startled. His gaze dropped briefly to the chair beneath him, then rose almost cautiously. Naomi. No expectations, she said gently. Just music and presence. He considered her. Then, slowly, he extended a hand. She took it. With fluid ease, she stepped around his chair, settling delicately on his lap, her arms circling his shoulders. He stiffened slightly, but then she felt him exhale, a breath waiting to be released. Together, they swayed, barely moving, but fully felt. Her cheek rested against his. Their hands found a rhythm. Her fingers curled lightly at his nape, while his palm pressed to the small of her back. The world narrowed to the warmth between them. No questions, no what-ifs. Just two people, carrying the weight of loss, of changes they never asked for, holding each other through one song, one shared breath, like it might be enough to keep the storm at bay a little longer. And for tonight, it would be. Their bodies remained still, but something inside them had begun to shift, slowly, silently, like ice melting beneath a quiet sunrise. Naomi didn't know how long they stayed like that. Minutes, maybe longer. Her body relaxed against his, drawn to the warmth beneath the tailored suit and the unfamiliar steadiness of his breath. She'd expected awkwardness, or hesitation, or even regret. But what she found instead was stillness. A rare kind. The kind that doesn't ask for anything but presence. She tilted her face slightly, her nose brushing the line of his jaw. It startled him. Not in fear, but in that vulnerable way a man flinches when he's not used to being held for nothing but softness. He shifted his head just enough to meet her gaze. And then, like gravity, inevitability, their lips found each other. It was not a kiss built on seduction. It wasn't hurried, or wild, or theatrical. It was exploratory, quiet, a question. And Naomi, with every soft motion of her mouth, gave an answer Thomas hadn't dared hope for. He tasted of whiskey and restraint. She tasted of something unfamiliar he couldn't name, but knew he'd remember. When they finally pulled apart, her breath was uneven, her cheeks flushed. He didn't speak, but she saw it. Something had cracked open inside him, something careful, something guarded. Naomi looked down at where their hands met, his large, steady fingers holding hers, as if trying to memorize the shape of her presence. "Would you?" she began, then paused, her voice catching. "Would you like some company tonight?" He studied her, not like a man calculating risk, but like one unsure whether he deserved what was offered. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." They didn't rush. He led her through the quiet hallway beyond the lounge, his chair gliding noiselessly over polished floors. The elevator chimed open. Naomi stood close behind him, feeling her heart beat with an urgency that wasn't fear, but something more fragile. A hush settled over her when the doors opened on the penthouse floor. His home surprised her, not by how grand it was, though it was that, but by how human it felt. No cold steel, No exaggerated modernism. Just warm wood floors, tall bookshelves, soft amber lighting, and the faint scent of cedar. A cello concerto hummed gently from somewhere unseen. She stepped inside, hesitating for a brief moment at the threshold. Thomas turned slightly. "You can still say no." Naomi smiled, slowly, and with genuine emotion. "I'm not here for the view." He wheeled ahead, and she followed, pausing only to slide off her coat and set her bag down. The silence between them deepened, not empty, but ripe with anticipation. He poured her a glass of water before excusing himself briefly. Naomi wandered toward the bookcase, running her fingers over the spines, medical journals, poetry, historical biographies, and one worn-out novel she recognized. When he returned, he'd changed, still dressed, but now without the formal shell of his earlier self. She, too, removed her heels, letting the cold floor ground her. They met in the middle of the living room. She approached slowly, stopping just before him. "Tell me if this is too much," she whispered. "It's not." She leaned in, cupped his jaw, and kissed him again, this time longer, with the intention that doesn't ask for morning. Their movements were slow, unrushed. It is as if we are trying to understand each other's boundaries, not with questions, but with care. Naomi helped guide him gently and respectfully to the edge of the bed. He looked up at her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "I can't," he began. "I know," she said softly, "and I'm not here to fix or expect. I want to be close." With that, she climbed onto the bed, kneeling beside him. Her fingers moved with patience, undoing the buttons of his shirt. He allowed her, slowly, to see the map of old scars and new strength written across his chest. She bent down and pressed her lips to each mark, reverent, quiet. When he reached for her, hands trembling just slightly, she guided them to her hips. They undressed each other with the care that only exists between two people who understand brokenness, who know that intimacy isn't just in touch, but in trust. They didn't make love in the way movies show it. No perfect rhythm, no choreographed passion. It was real, human, beautiful in its imperfection. When they moved together, it was not to chase release, but to feel, to be seen, to let go. Remember that tenderness could bloom even in bodies marked by pain or time. Afterward, they lay in quiet. Naomi rested her head on his chest, her hand tracing lazy circles along his ribcage. Thomas stared at the ceiling, breathing slowly. He didn't speak, and neither did she. But after a long stretch of silence, he whispered, almost to himself, "I didn't think this would happen again." She closed her eyes and murmured, "Me neither." The wind howled faintly beyond the windows. Snow still fell in ribbons, but inside, wrapped in layers of skin and silence, and something more profound, they drifted into sleep. Not as strangers anymore, but not yet anything defined. Just two people had permitted themselves to feel it for one night, and for now, that was enough. The first thing Naomi noticed was the quiet, not the kind that filled rooms when people were absent, but the type that arrived after something meaningful had occurred, like a stage curtain falling after a hushed final scene. The sheets were still warm beneath her as she stirred, eyes adjusting to the faint morning light that crept through the edges of the blackout curtains. She lay still for a moment, listening, to his breathing, to the faint ticking of a clock somewhere, to the pulse in her chest. Slower now, softer. Thomas lay beside her, unmoving except for the rise and fall of his chest. In sleep, his face lost its careful composure. The angles of his jaw looked gentler. His mouth, usually so precise in its restraint, was slightly parted. He looked younger somehow, or less guarded. She didn't touch him. They didn't want to disturb the peace that had settled over, like snowfall. Instead, she turned slowly onto her side and traced the outline of his shoulder with her gaze. The gentle slope of it, the way his skin bore the faintest trace of freckles where the sunlight hadn't reached in years. It felt unreal. Not the night they'd shared, but how safe it had felt. How unhurried. No declarations, no expectations. Only a quiet communion between two people who hadn't meant to need anyone. Naomi sat up eventually, drawing the blanket around her as she stepped lightly onto the polished floor. She gathered her clothes silently, folding them carefully on a nearby chair before slipping into the bathroom. The mirror greeted her with a face both familiar and changed. Her curls were tousled, her skin bare of makeup, her eyes rimmed with a kind of softness that wasn't there yesterday. She didn't look like a woman in love. She looked like someone who had been seen, and maybe that was rarer. By the time she returned to the bedroom, Thomas was still asleep. She hovered at the doorway for a moment longer than she meant to. There were words she could have said. Something poetic, something simple. But she didn't want to ruin the delicate equilibrium between them. So instead, she left without a note. Not out of cowardice, but because she understood that not every moment needed a bow. Some nights were meant to live only in memory. She entered the elevator, the silence folding around her like a cocoon. Her reflection blinked back at her in the polished walls, barefaced, composed, but far from untouched. The lobby was nearly empty when she passed through. Outside, the city was beginning to thaw. The snow had stopped, leaving behind streets dusted in white and kissed with sunlight. Boston felt reborn like towns sometimes do after a storm, quietly, without fanfare. She walked 2 blocks before she realized she was still holding something. His business card. She hadn't remembered taking it. It must have been sitting on the nightstand, beneath a coaster, or beside a book. Maybe she picked it up without thinking. Perhaps part of her had already decided to take a piece of him with her. Dr. Thomas Whitaker, founder and former chief scientist, Whitaker Neurotech. She stared at the fine print, the bold serif font. It didn't surprise her that he was someone important. He had the kind of gravity that couldn't be faked. But seeing it in ink made it feel more real. He wasn't just a man with kind eyes and quiet strength. He was someone who had changed lives. And yet, he'd allowed himself to be vulnerable with her. Not the polished version, the real one. Naomi tucked the card into her coat pocket and turned toward the subway entrance. As the escalator hummed downward, the station's fluorescent lights replaced the luxury glow of the hotel. Cold air bit at her skin again. But something inside her had shifted. The train came. She stepped in, found a seat, let her head rest lightly against the window. She didn't think of what came next. She didn't write imaginary texts or wonder when he might call. She remembered his voice when he whispered her name, low and reverent, like it meant more than just a moment. The next few days passed in fragments. She returned to her tiny third-floor walk-up in Roxbury, where the radiator clanged more than it warmed, and the hot water came in unpredictable bursts. Her studio desk, still cluttered with old sketches and unopened bills, sat by the window, untouched. She tried to sketch again, but the lines didn't come. Not yet. At night, she lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to recall the exact pressure of his fingers on her back, the curve of his mouth when he almost smiled, the way the jazz had wrapped around them like silk. And though she told herself it was just one night, something passing, something beautiful and brief, a quiet tug persisted beneath her ribs. Then, one morning, everything changed. It was subtle at first. She missed her period. She chalked it up to stress. Too much wine, A strange sleep cycle. But then a week passed, then another. Her body felt different. Not sick exactly, but unfamiliar. She bought a test at a corner store 2 blocks from her apartment, then another from a pharmacy across town, because she didn't trust the first. The second confirmed what the first had whispered. Positive. Pregnant. Naomi sat on the bathroom floor, knees pulled to her chest, the test still clutched in her hand. For a long time, she didn't cry. She didn't scream, didn't panic. She sat. She listened to the sound of the world outside her cracked window. Car horns, distant sirens. Life continues, oblivious to the revolution happening inside her. And when the tears finally came, they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of knowing. Because something had taken root inside her. Not just life, but consequences. Continuation. Legacy. She placed a hand gently against her stomach. She didn't need to ask if it was real. She knew just like she had known him. And in that quiet moment, everything about that night began to mean something more. Naomi never imagined silence could feel so loud. In the days that followed the test, her apartment became a cocoon of quiet. The radiator hissed on and off like it always had. The neighbor's television hummed faintly through the walls, and the world outside kept spinning in predictable, indifferent rhythms. But inside her, everything was changing. She booked an appointment at a women's health clinic 2 train stops away. The waiting room was warm and plain, decorated with worn posters about prenatal vitamins and first trimester symptoms. She kept her coat on, fingers knotted tightly in her lap. No one knew she was there, not even her. The nurse called her name was kind, with a voice that didn't rise or fall too sharply, as if she'd learned to speak in tones that wouldn't tip anyone over the edge. They took her vitals, asked her questions, confirmed the obvious. Yes, she was pregnant. Yes, about 6 weeks. And then came the sonogram. Naomi lay back as the technician gently applied the cool gel to her abdomen. She stared at the ceiling, white, speckled, impersonal, between resignation and disbelief. But when the machine hummed to life, something flickered on the screen. The technician narrowed her eyes, adjusted the angle, and smiled faintly. "Well," she murmured, almost like she was speaking to the monitor itself. "That's unexpected." Naomi's stomach tightened. "What is?" "There are 2. Naomi turned her head. "2?" The woman nodded, her tone soft but steady. 2 gestational sacs. 2 heartbeats. You're carrying twins." For a moment, the world went utterly still. Not quite. Silent. As if even her pulse had paused, suspended in air. She stared at the screen, the tiny white flashes barely the size of lentils. Flickering. Alive. Both of them. Her vision blurred. The technician handed her a tissue without a word. Naomi took it with shaking fingers, unable to process the moment's fullness. Not 1 life, but 2. Not just a future, 2 of them. She left the clinic clutching the ultrasound photo like it might dissolve if she let it go. That night, she sat on her bed, knees drawn up, the photo placed gently in the center of her sketchbook. Her phone sat nearby, the screen dark and untouched. Thomas's card was tucked inside her wallet, where she'd nearly worn the corner down from rubbing it absently with her thumb. She stared at it for a long time. Then she dialed. Once. Twice. Voicemail. A soft female voice answered, professional and distant. "You've reached Dr. Whitaker's office. Please leave a message." She didn't. The next morning, she tried again. This time, a receptionist answered, "I'm sorry. Dr. Whitaker is in meetings all day. Would you like to leave a message?" "Yes," Naomi replied, voice tight. Tell him Naomi Brooks called. She gave her number. Hung up. Waited. Nothing. The next day, she tried again. Still nothing. By the end of the week, she'd called 5 times. Each time, she was met with the same polite refusal, the same gatekeeper tone, the same empty promise that someone might pass along. By the 6th call, her voice shook. "This isn't about me," she said to the assistant. "It's about something he deserves to know." She hung up before the woman could answer. That evening, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, the ultrasound tucked beneath a cracked mug of ginger tea, her hands curled around her belly. Not because it was showing, nothing had changed visibly yet, but because the weight of what was growing inside her had begun to settle deeper than flesh. She needed to try one last time. Not for him, for them. The following morning, Naomi dressed carefully. Not for vanity, but for armor. She chose a navy blazer that barely fit across her chest anymore, a white blouse with clean lines and pressed slacks. She tied her curls back with a silk scarf her mother once gave her. Lipstick. Minimal jewelry. Composure. When she arrived at Whitacre Neurotech, the glass tower loomed above her like a monument to lives she didn't belong to. The marble lobby was sleek and cold, with people who moved with purpose and invisible appointments. Naomi walked up to the front desk and gave her name. "I need to speak with Dr. Whitacre," she said. "It's urgent." The receptionist looked up, blinking. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Then I'm afraid—" "I'm pregnant," Naomi interrupted, voice low but firm. "With his children. And I'm not leaving until I speak with him." The woman stared. A pause. Then picked up the phone. Within minutes, a junior associate in a fitted blazer appeared and led her wordlessly to the executive elevator. The ride was silent, no small talk. Naomi watched the numbers light up as the floor count rose, each one more surreal than the last. When the doors opened, she was led into a sunlit office the size of her apartment. Thomas was behind the desk. He looked up and stopped mid-sentence, whatever conversation he'd been having cut short. The person beside him, an older man in a suit, glanced between them, excused himself, and closed the door behind him. "Naomi," Thomas said, voice full of disbelief. I can't believe it's you." She stood still, arms folded tightly, pulse pounding in her ears. "I tried to reach you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They wouldn't let me through." His brows furrowed. "My assistant never mentioned—" "I called. I left my name. Repeatedly." He stood, sliding his chair back, rolling toward her quickly, urgency laced in every motion. What's wrong?" he asked. "Are you okay?" Naomi placed a hand over her abdomen. "I'm pregnant," she said. Silence. He stared at her, blinked, searched her eyes like he needed confirmation in more than words. "I'm having your babies," she said softly. He gripped the wheels of his chair. "Babies?" She nodded. "Twins." Thomas exhaled sharply, a sound caught somewhere between wonder and disbelief. "I was told I couldn't. After the accident, they said it was unlikely, nearly impossible." "Well," Naomi said quietly, "it seems your body disagreed." He rolled forward until he was inches from her, gaze dropping to her midsection. There was no visible bump yet, but something in the air had shifted, like he could feel what words could not yet show. "May I?" he asked, voice hoarse. She took a half-step closer. He raised his hand slowly and laid his palm gently, reverently, just above her waist. And in that moment, something passed between them that neither could name. Not love, not yet, but gravity, a center of belonging. His voice cracked. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Naomi replied, her eyes soft. You just needed to know." Thomas looked up, his expression unreadable, but not unfeeling. "Thank you," he whispered, "for telling me, for not walking away." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The weight of unspoken words now sat between them like a drawn breath. And nothing, not even the life they'd led before, would ever be the same again. Thomas hadn't spoken for a long time. He sat behind the vast walnut desk, the same desk Naomi had once imagined him ruling empires from, and now he looked small, not diminished, but disarmed. His palm still rested near her abdomen, as if afraid to remove it, as though contact was the only way to keep reality from unraveling. Naomi stood motionless, her arms folded gently, more from instinct than defense. The warmth of his touch lingered even after he pulled away. She saw it then, that flicker beneath his composed exterior. Not just shock, not just wonder, but the tremor of fear that rises in someone who knows how fragile joy can be. He cleared his throat, voice low. "Are you okay?" Her eyes softened. "So far, yes. Tired. Some nausea, but nothing I can't handle." Thomas leaned back, slowly, carefully. "And the twins? They're strong." She gave him a small, quiet smile. Their heartbeats were steady. Perfect. He looked down, then back up again. "And you've done this alone?" Naomi didn't flinch. "I've done it as long as I had to." The weight of that answer hung between them. It wasn't a condemnation, just the truth, and he didn't try to justify it. Instead, he leaned into the discomfort of it, as if accepting it was the only way to move forward. He ran a hand through his hair, then looked up again, eyes clearer now. "Come with me." She blinked. "Where?" He didn't answer, just wheeled toward the door. Naomi followed. The elevator at the far end of the corridor opened into a private residential wing. The air smelled faintly of cedarwood and linen. They moved through wide hallways lined with framed photographs. Thomas with scientists, smiling children in hospital gowns, ribbon cuttings for medical initiatives. Naomi realized, for the first time, how much of his life had been devoted to healing others, even while quietly managing his wounds. They reached a doorway at the end of the hall. He paused, then gestured toward it. "I had this suite renovated after my last surgery. It's quiet, comfortable. The light's good in the mornings. There's a private entrance if you want privacy, and an on-call OB who can visit weekly if that's something you'd consider." Naomi stared at the open door. Inside was a luxurious and understated space. Muted tones, soft textures, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Charles River. A small sitting area, a bed dressed in ivory and gray. A walk-in closet she could have easily turned into an art studio. Her breath caught. "This is temporary," he said quickly. "Only if you want it. I'm not asking you to move in as anything but yourself, the mother of my children. I want to know you're safe." Naomi turned to face him fully. "I've survived worse with less." "I know," he said gently, "but you shouldn't have to now." She paused. There was a version of her that would have refused out of pride, that would have walked out, chin high, determined to do everything independently, because she'd been taught that love, like help, was never free. But there were two lives inside her now, and the future she owed them didn't have room for stubbornness dressed as independence. She nodded. For now. Relief washed over his features, as subtle as it was palpable. Good. A black sedan pulled up in front of her building the next morning. The polite and nondescript driver loaded her single suitcase into the trunk. Naomi locked the door behind her without ceremony. She didn't look back. The Whitaker estate sat gently above the river, where glass met stone in a seamless dialogue between modernity and nature. She felt a strange flutter as the gates opened. Not nerves exactly. Something else. A feeling she couldn't name yet. A shift. Thomas met her at the entrance. No assistants, no staff. Just him in a slate-gray sweater and tailored slacks, his hair slightly tousled like he hadn't slept much. He looked at her like someone who had waited long, but never expected the moment to arrive. "Welcome home," he said. Naomi stepped inside. The interior smelled of eucalyptus and faint citrus. The foyer opened into an expansive living space, filled with soft light, warm woods, and clean lines. It was beautiful, but more importantly, it felt lived in. "This way," he said, leading her through the home. He didn't try to impress her. He didn't apologize for what it was. He showed her the guest suite, kitchen, and sunroom with water views. "We brought in a nutritionist," he said, "but the chef can prepare whatever you're craving, even if it's peanut butter and pickles." She raised an eyebrow. He smiled. "I did my reading." Naomi laughed softly, the sound warming the space between them. Later that evening, she stood at the window of her new room, watching the last light fade from the sky. Her fingers rested lightly on her belly, where two tiny lives moved invisibly through her blood and bones. She heard a soft knock. "Come in." Thomas entered, holding 2 mugs. "Chamomile," he said, offering one. "Thought you might want something warm." She took it. "Thanks." He didn't sit, just hovered, unsure. "I can leave if you want space," he said. "You don't have to." They stood there in silence, sipping slowly. Then Naomi turned, facing him directly. "Why did you stop taking calls?" He winced. "I didn't know. I swear. My assistant. She filters everything. After the last few years, I stopped trusting easily. I thought I was protecting myself." She held his gaze. "You were. But it hurt anyway." "I know." His voice was quiet. "And I'll spend as long as it takes proving I won't disappear again." She studied him. There was no bravado, no grand apology. Just a man standing in the middle of his past, trying to build something better. Naomi set her mug down. "I'm not here for promises," she said. "Just the truth." Thomas nodded. "Then we start there." And that night, for the first time in weeks, Naomi slept through without waking. There were no dreams, no regrets, just steady breath and a slow, growing awareness that something was changing, not just in her body, but in the rhythm of her life. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something just as rare: trust. They didn't fall into a rhythm overnight. In truth, it took time. A collection of gentle collisions and awkward hesitations, of warm silences and soft retreats. Naomi first moved through the Whitaker estate like a guest, polite, measured, careful not to overstep. She folded her sweaters too neatly, made the bed each morning before the housekeeper could, and kept her voice low even when no one else was around. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls began to shift. It started with the small things. Thomas added herbal tea to the pantry after she mentioned she missed a specific blend from a downtown cafe. One morning, she found sketching pencils on her nightstand, a fresh stack of ivory paper, and no note, just the quiet implication that someone had been paying attention. He didn't bring it up. Neither did she. In the mornings, they often crossed paths at the kitchen island. Naomi was in her oversized cardigan, hair tied loosely atop her head. Thomas was already dressed, reading medical journals or scrolling through industry updates. He always looked up when she entered. Always. At first, their conversation stayed shallow. How she was sleeping, what the twins might like that day, whether she was eating enough protein. But then the questions shifted. He asked about her art, her childhood, what she missed about Atlanta, what she didn't. She told him things in fragments, about the mural she painted at 16 on the side of an abandoned laundromat, about the way her mother used to hum Nina Simone while cooking, about the last time she'd fallen in love, and how it had left her feeling more invisible than seen. Thomas listened the way he did everything else, without interruption, without trying to fix it. And when she asked about his accident, he didn't flinch. "It was raining," he said one evening, seated beside her in the sunroom, the sky blushing with the colors of early spring. "I wasn't even supposed to be in the car. My research partner had just gotten engaged. I told him to celebrate. I took his place." The driver nodded off on the highway. "I woke up in a hospital I didn't remember entering." He spoke plainly, without dramatics, but his hand tightened around the armrest of his chair when he said it. "I spent a year in rehab centers, trying to feel useful again. At some point, I realized healing wouldn't be about walking again. It would be about reimagining who I was without that version of myself." Naomi didn't say she was proud of him. She didn't need to. Instead, she leaned over and placed her hand gently on his. "Maybe we're both still learning to reimagine," she said. That night, they decorated the nursery together. The space had been painted weeks ago in a soft bone white, but had remained untouched, waiting. Naomi walked in barefoot, the hardwood cool beneath her soles. Thomas followed behind her, pausing to take in how she ran her fingers along the molding, already envisioning the room not as a concept, but as a life. "I thought you might like to pick the details," he said. She smiled. "I'd like that." They spent the next few hours surrounded by tiny things: ivory linen curtains, wooden mobiles carved with clouds, shelves waiting to be filled with picture books and soft plush animals. Thomas opened a large box containing the crib, and without needing to ask, Naomi joined him on the floor to assemble it. They worked side by side, her legs folded beneath her, his chair angled for reach. Every screw and wooden slat felt like a declaration of intention, of presence, of something slowly becoming permanent. At one point, Naomi paused, a small onesie in her hands, soft lavender cotton with the words, "Little Dreamer" stitched across the chest. "Do you ever imagine them?" she asked. "What will they look like? Who will they be?" Thomas leaned back slightly. "All the time. I wonder if they'll fight over the same toy, or if one of them will inherit my obsessive need for order." He glanced at her playfully. "God help them if they inherit your craving for spicy pickles." She laughed, the sound full and bright. "I hope they're curious," she said, more seriously now. "I hope they ask questions. Hard ones. I hope they feel safe enough to." Thomas nodded. "I hope they know they're wanted." The room quieted at that, because beneath the paint colors and folded blankets, that was what it all came down to, making room for something they hadn't planned, but were choosing. Actively. Repeatedly. Later that week, Naomi stood in the garden just beyond the house, where the early tulips had begun to bloom in soft blush and cream. She held a small notebook, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She didn't notice how long she'd been out there until a breeze kicked up and caught the hem of her dress. She turned and found Thomas watching her from the patio. "Sketching?" he asked, wheeling closer. Naomi nodded, trying to remember how. "May I see?" She hesitated, then handed the notebook to him. He flipped through the pages slowly. Soft charcoal strokes danced across the paper, still incomplete but intimate shapes. A curve of the shoulder, a child's profile, 2 hands, intertwined. "They're beautiful," he said. She shrugged. "They're honest." He looked up. So are you. Naomi studied him for a long moment. The light caught in his eyes, making them look a shade warmer. She felt something stir inside her. Not new, but undeniable. She reached forward, brushing a stray strand of hair from his forehead, and for the first time, he didn't flinch. That night, as they sat in the living room after dinner, Naomi leaned lightly on his shoulder while they listened to Miles Davis hum through the speakers. No words, no defined roles, just quiet closeness. He didn't ask her to stay longer than the pregnancy. She didn't ask what they were becoming, but when she fell asleep on the couch beside him, and he shifted just enough to place a blanket over her shoulders, something passed between them that neither of them had the courage or need to name. It wasn't about titles or timing. It was about fitting into the room like she'd always belonged there. He looked at her like the house had been waiting for her to arrive. How trust, once broken, had begun to rebuild itself, not loudly, but in the small, steady architecture of everyday things. The first touch wasn't planned. It happened in the garden on a morning soft with sun, where the roses had begun to stretch themselves open in slow motion. White, blush, pale gold. Naomi had gone out with her phone in one hand and a cup of ginger tea in the other, hoping to take pictures of the early blooms for a children's book idea she'd quietly been sketching at night. She was 6 months along, and her belly moved before she did, curving how the earth made room for something it had chosen to grow. She bent slowly to get a better angle on a bloom that looked like it was about to yawn open. The stone path beneath her shifted, just enough for her heel to catch and her body to lurch forward. Naomi. Thomas's voice, sharp and low, came before his arms did, one catching her elbow, the other finding her waist in a practiced, almost automatic motion. She gasped, not from pain, but surprise, and found herself inches from his face. Their breath tangled. His hands stayed at her sides, steadying her, not possessive, not afraid, just there. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight around the edges. Naomi blinked. "Yes. I think I just lost balance for a second." Thomas looked her over, scanning not just her, but the life she carried. His fingers flexed slightly where they held her, and something shifted in that space between the question and the answer. It was the closeness, the scent of her skin, the way the wind stirred her curls across his cheek. For a brief second, the world stilled. And in that stillness, their eyes met. Naomi saw it first in his, something flickering beneath the careful restraint he always wore like armor. Want, not lust, not impulse, but the aching, breathless want of someone who had tried not to need anything for a long time. Her breath caught. He didn't move closer, but he didn't let go either. And when she reached up, slow and unsure, brushing a thumb across the edge of his jaw, he leaned into it like a man starved for tenderness. "Don't," he whispered, but it wasn't a warning. It was a plea. Naomi didn't press forward, didn't close the final space between them. Instead, she lowered her hand, fingers brushing lightly over his shirt. The wind broke the moment before they could. Thomas pulled back, releasing her gently. "Let's get you inside." She nodded, her voice lost somewhere behind her ribs. Later that afternoon, while folding tiny cotton onesies in the nursery, Naomi caught herself pausing mid-motion, her fingers wrapped around a sleeve so small it made her heart ache. The moment in the garden played over again in her mind, not just how he held her, the way he stopped himself. She wasn't used to that kind of restraint, not in a man who looked at her like Thomas did, like she was the first softness he'd let close in years. That evening, she hovered in the hallway outside his study. The door was slightly ajar. Light spilled out across the floor in warm amber. Inside, Thomas sat with his head in his hand, staring at a closed laptop as though its weight was too much. She knocked softly, then stepped in without waiting for an answer. He looked up. "Couldn't sleep," she said. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Neither can I." She didn't take it. Instead, she strolled toward the desk, resting both hands on the edge. "Are you afraid?" she asked gently. He didn't pretend not to understand. "I don't know what to do with this," he said. "With you. With wanting more." Naomi studied him. "You think it's too soon?" "I think it's too fast," he said. "Too easy, which means it's probably dangerous." She smiled faintly. "It hasn't felt easy to me." Thomas's mouth twitched into something like a laugh, dry and careful. "I've spent years building a life around being untouchable, around control, predictability. This, us, it doesn't fit that blueprint." Naomi stepped around the desk, moving slowly until she stood beside him. She crouched down to meet his eyes. "What if it's not supposed to fit?" she asked. "What if it's meant to build something new?" He looked at her like he didn't know how to believe that. Like hope was something that belonged to other people. "I'm terrified," he admitted. "So am I," she whispered. She reached for his hand, and when their fingers touched, it was quiet and charged, like the first crack of thunder before the rain. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "You don't owe me anything. You're already giving me more than I thought I'd ever have." Naomi shook her head, steady and sure. "I'm not doing this because of the babies. I'm doing this because I see you, and because I know what it means to feel invisible and still want someone to fight for you." His throat moved, and no sound came when he tried to speak. She placed her hand gently against his cheek. "Stop trying to talk yourself out of being wanted." And that was all it took. The tension in his shoulders cracked, his jaw softened, and he pulled her onto his lap in a single, swift motion. Not roughly, not out of desperation, but like it was the most natural thing he'd ever done. His arms wrapped around her, and his head dropped against her shoulder. Naomi didn't speak. She just held him. For a long time, they stayed like that. No kisses, no declarations, just warmth, breath, connection. Eventually, he whispered, "If you stay after they're born, I want it to be because you chose me, not because you feel trapped." Naomi leaned back, just far enough to look at him. Her eyes were full. Her voice was quiet but confident. "Then let me make that choice." He searched her face like a man afraid to believe he was being offered something real. And she let him look, let him see her, all of her, without fear, without apology. When their lips met, it wasn't hurried or hot or desperate. It was steady, grounded, a seal, an answer. They didn't need words after that. They just needed time. And for the first time, time felt like something they could give each other freely. The next morning, I arrived in pieces. Soft light spilled across the duvet in a slow exhale, brushing over Naomi's bare shoulder as she stirred. The warmth behind her hadn't faded. Thomas was still there, awake, still, like he hadn't dared move in fear that the moment would vanish. She didn't open her eyes right away. Instead, she allowed herself to memorize the weight of his arm curled around her waist, the rhythm of his breath just behind her neck, the quiet intimacy of sharing a space, not with a stranger, but with someone who had finally allowed her in. When she did turn, it was slow, her belly rounding between them like a whispered reminder that this wasn't just about them anymore. Thomas watched her with the kind of gaze that made time irrelevant. "You stayed," he said, voice rough with mourning and something more fragile. Naomi smiled, brushing his hair back with a light touch. I wasn't planning on leaving. He exhaled in a way that sounded almost like relief. There was no need to talk about the night before. It wasn't a performance to recap. It had been gentle, patient, full of pauses and tenderness, and the kind of silent devotion only people with scarred histories know how to offer. Later that morning, Thomas insisted on making breakfast. She watched from the kitchen island as he awkwardly maneuvered scrambled eggs, toast, and fruit onto 2 plates. The angles imperfect, but the effort absolute. His movements were deliberate, sometimes clumsy, but never self-conscious. There was a beauty in that, how he allowed her to see him in moments that weren't polished. "I should have ordered room service," he muttered, eyeing a piece of slightly burnt toast. Naomi reached across the counter and stole a bite anyway. "No, this is perfect." They ate in companionable silence, legs brushing beneath the table, the sounds of silverware and sunlight filling the room more than words could. She asked between sips of orange juice, "Did you ever think about what your life would have looked like if the accident never happened?" Thomas paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "All the time," he admitted. "I used to imagine the other version of me, standing, running, commanding rooms without effort. I mourned him for a long time." Naomi didn't press. He continued, quieter now. "But I think, if I hadn't been in that car or lost what I thought defined me, I wouldn't be here. With you." She reached across the table, taking his hand. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. That afternoon, Naomi wandered into the nursery. It was finished now, the crib assembled, the shelves filled, the curtains drawn just enough to let filtered light in. She stood at the center of the room, running her fingers over the tiny folded clothes. Her imagination filled in the rest. 2 girls with sleepy eyes and curious fingers, laughter in the hallway, lullabies hummed in mismatched harmonies. She was still standing there when Thomas entered behind her. He didn't speak at first, just took in the sight of her, barefoot, rounded with new life, wrapped in a silence he somehow knew not to break. "We've created something beautiful," he said finally. Naomi turned to him, her eyes soft. "More than I ever dreamed." He wheeled closer, then reached for her hand. Instead of pulling her to him, he drew her gently into his lap, arms sliding around her waist in a motion so familiar now, it no longer felt borrowed. She rested her head against his shoulder. "I used to think I'd never be enough for someone like you," she whispered. He pulled back just enough to see her face. "Someone like me?" Naomi nodded. "A man with purpose, with power, with this house and legacy and vision. I felt like a stray cat you fed once and forgot to let go." His expression hardened, but not in anger, in sorrow. "Don't you ever say that again," he said, voice steady. "You didn't just walk into my life. You breathed life back into it. You didn't ask me to fix anything. You let me feel needed without being broken." Tears threatened the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I love you," he said. It was simple, undramatic, said with such certainty that it anchored everything. Naomi's voice was smaller. "I love you too." He laid a hand gently on her belly. "Our girls, they're going to grow up knowing what love looks like." That night, the air shifted. Naomi stood at the mirror in their bedroom, wrapped in a silk gown that hugged the new curves of her body, the ones she was still learning to accept. Her back ached slightly, her ankles swollen, but her reflection held something new, something luminous. She turned. "Do you still want me?" she asked, unadorned. Thomas wheeled closer until they were inches apart. He didn't answer with words. Instead, He reached for her, tracing his hands down her waist, reverent and unhurried. "I've always wanted you," he murmured. Naomi climbed gently into his lap, mindful of the shape between them. He held her like she was still made of light, like every part of her was holy. Their kisses were slow, deep, less fire, more gravity. They moved together again, not in haste, but with the rhythm of people who knew they had time now. Time to explore, savor, memorize each breath, and tremble and whispered name. Afterward, they lay tangled in soft sheets, the room dim but full. Thomas traced circles over the curve of her belly, while Naomi rested her head against his chest. "You ever get scared?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Every day. Me too." He kissed her forehead. "But we're not doing this alone. No promises, just presence." Naomi fell asleep to the sound of his heartbeat beneath her ear, and the steady kick of two lives inside her, nestled between what had been lost and what was now being built. And in that liminal space, love began to settle not as a feeling, but as a foundation. The wind smelled like magnolias that morning. Naomi stepped onto the back terrace barefoot, cradling a warm cup of tea against her chest. Her silk robe billowed gently around her calves as the spring breeze teased loose strands of hair from her braid. Somewhere in the garden below, the gardener was trimming the hedges, and the soft hum of shears blended into the birdsong like a forgotten lullaby. She stood there in stillness, 8 months into a pregnancy that no longer felt abstract. Every breath came with a weight shift. Every movement demanded permission from the 2 daughters nested beneath her ribs. They were no longer quiet passengers. They had presence now, kicking, turning, waking her with their synchronized demands and stubborn rhythms. Thomas had left a note beside the kettle that morning, written in his clean, even script. "Doctor at 10. Don't forget to eat first." Tea simple, but the kind of ordinary care that had become the structure of her days. She smiled, pressing the edge of the mug to her lips. Inside, the house was still. She padded back through the wide hallway slowly, one hand braced at the small of her back, the other resting over the swell of her belly. The nursery door was open, curtains fluttering. Naomi glanced inside as she passed, heart tightening at the sight of the 2 bassinets, side by side in soft light. She paused, brushing her fingers across the back of a rocking chair. There were carefully folded blankets, picture books arranged by height, and a tiny ivory sweater someone had sent without a return address. The room felt ready, but she wasn't sure she was. Later that afternoon, after the checkup, heartbeat strong, blood pressure stable, one baby already head down, they stopped at a small bakery Naomi had mentioned weeks ago, almost in passing. Thomas had remembered, of course. The glass display still shimmered with honeyed pastries, and the air smelled like cinnamon and nostalgia. She sat at a table near the window while he ordered. She blinked when he returned, setting a warm pecan tart before her. "You remembered." Thomas smirked. "I remember everything that makes your face light up." She rolled her eyes, but the blush reached her collarbone. "That's dangerous." He leaned closer. "So are you." They shared the tart slowly, in no rush, like people who'd learned to stretch a moment wide enough to feel like eternity. When they arrived home, the sun had begun to lower itself behind the trees. Naomi stepped into the garden again, tugging her shawl tighter against her shoulders. The sky had shifted, more gold than blue now. She walked carefully toward the rose bushes, crouching to snap a photo of a new bloom. As she stood again, her body betrayed her. Her heel caught on a stray stone, and the sudden pitch of weight forward forced a gasp from her lips. She didn't fall, because Thomas was there. He had moved faster than she thought possible, catching her elbow with one hand, the curve of her back with the other. They froze. Her breath heaved against his chest. His voice came rough, tight, careful. She nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't see it. Thomas's fingers didn't leave her. One hand remained steady and firm at her waist, the other brushing gently against her cheek, as if to confirm that she was unhurt. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to you, he whispered. The air thickened. Naomi looked up. They were too close again, but neither moved away this time. The world shrank around the space between their mouths. Her hand found the front of his shirt and curled into it. His gaze dropped to her lips and stayed there. Her voice came softer than the wind. Then, don't let go. Their lips met in the quietest kind of urgency, slow, but fueled by something that had been building across days and weeks and long, sleepless nights. It wasn't just longing. It was fear. It was relief. It was the realization that they had almost lost the thing they hadn't dared name. When they pulled apart, breathless and half-dazed, Thomas touched his forehead to hers. I can't keep pretending I don't want all of this, he said. Naomi's eyes searched his. Then stop pretending. That night, they didn't make love out of need. They made it out of belonging. Naomi stood by the window in a cotton nightgown that traced the new shape of her body with reverence. She turned slowly when Thomas approached, his eyes never leaving her, his expression unreadable, but not distant. You're glowing, he said quietly. She hesitated. Even like this? Especially like this. She stepped toward him. I'm not the same woman I was. Thomas met her halfway. Good. I love this version of you more. He reached for her, tracing her jawline with his hand before letting it fall to her belly. She placed her hands over his, eyes glassy. It wasn't out of the question when she finally climbed into his lap. It wasn't foreplay. It was a homecoming. They undressed each other without a rush, without choreography. There was no need to prove anything, just the slow unfolding of skin and trust. He touched her like he was relearning a prayer, and she held him like he was the answer she hadn't dared write down. Later, tangled in sheets and sleep and skin, Thomas whispered into the crook of her neck, I want this. Not just tonight. Not just until they're born. Naomi's voice was a breath. So do I. He kissed her shoulder, the space behind her ear, the curve of her spine. I want us to be a family. Naomi didn't answer right away, but her hand found his, threading their fingers together. We already are, she whispered. The words hung in the quiet like a vow neither had said aloud, until now. And as the moon rose above the city, casting silver light across the bed and the bodies within it, the house, for the first time, felt not just full, but whole. The first contraction came just before dawn. Naomi stirred in bed, curled tightly against Thomas's chest. The kind of sleep only granted to those who'd made peace with what came before. The room was quiet, the windows fogged with early light, the hush of an April morning resting like a secret on the sill. At first, she didn't recognize the discomfort. It was a low, insistent ache in her back, stretching forward into her lower abdomen, like a thread pulled too tightly. She shifted slightly, pressing a hand to her belly, now taut and full, and waited for the sensation to pass. It didn't. Naomi's breath caught mid-inhale when the second one came, sharper, deeper. Thomas, she whispered, her voice thin but urgent. He stirred immediately. In the weeks since they'd fallen into something resembling a rhythm, Naomi had learned he wasn't a heavy sleeper. His instincts had changed. The once defensive silence of a man used to solitude had given way to a gentle vigilance, especially when it came to her. His arm tightened around her waist. "What is it?" he asked, still raspy with sleep. She turned toward him. "I think it's time." There was no panic, just a pause. One breath, maybe two, before he sat up fully, composure falling over him like muscle memory. "Okay, breathe. We've rehearsed this." He helped her sit up, guided her legs over the edge of the bed, hands steady even as her grip tightened around his shoulder. The pain rolled through her again, this time undeniable. Real. She braced herself against it, trying to breathe through the pressure and sudden fear. "Call the doctor," she murmured. "Already done." By the time she had changed into the maternity dress they'd packed just in case, the private car was already waiting. The driver opened the door with careful efficiency, his expression calm, trained, discreet. Thomas climbed in beside her, his hand finding hers and not letting go. The drive to the hospital was short, but it stretched into something longer in Naomi's memory. Each bump in the road felt amplified. Each contraction came closer, tighter, demanding her attention in full. She squeezed Thomas's hand without apology. He bore it in silence, murmuring steady encouragement with every mile. "You're strong. I'm here. We're almost there." When they arrived, the hospital staff ushered them into a private birthing suite with soft lighting and a view of the river beyond the glass. Naomi registered little of it. The pain had become a rhythm now, crashing over her in steady, relentless waves. Doctors, nurses, monitors, warm hands on her forehead, cords clipped to her fingers. Time dissolved. She clung to Thomas's voice, the single thread that tethered her to something beyond the intensity of her body. At one point, she screamed. At another, she wept. And when it felt like she had nothing left to give, when every muscle trembled and her lungs burned, when her back arched and her vision blurred, a cry split the air. Then another, two cries, barely a heartbeat apart, like the world had been holding its breath for them. Naomi collapsed back against the pillows, drenched in sweat, lungs heaving. Her arms felt too weak to lift. Her throat was raw. But when the nurse placed a tiny, wriggling bundle on her chest, wrapped in soft cloth and smelling of something impossibly new, Naomi forgot everything. Then came the second. Two girls, pink-skinned and blinking, their small faces turned instinctively toward her, one with a squall that filled the room like a protest, the other, quieter, mouth pursed in something resembling contemplation. Thomas stood beside her, silent, utterly still. One hand was on her shoulder, and the other was raised to his mouth as though afraid the emotion might escape if he let it. "Do you want to hold her?" the nurse asked. He nodded, wordless. The quieter twin was placed in his arms with care. Naomi watched his eyes shift as he stared down at the weight he now carried. No longer theoretical, no longer ultrasound shadows, but real. Breathing. Beautiful. "She's real," he whispered. Naomi smiled through tears. "They both are." He looked at her, eyes glassy, as if unable to hold it all. "You did everything." "We did," she corrected softly. Back at the estate, the rhythm of life changed overnight. Days bled into nights and back again, marked by the sharp cry of hunger, the soft hum of lullabies, the creak of the nursery rocker. Naomi lost track of what day it was. Time became elastic, bending around feedings and diapers and skin-to-skin warmth. But never, not once, did she feel alone. Thomas was there for every moment. Every 2 a.m. diaper change. Every bottle was warmed with military precision. He rolled into the nursery ahead of her most nights, scooping up whichever twin was stirring first, whispering their names like a prayer. Isla, Elodie. Naomi watched him in awe. How easily he fell into fatherhood. How instinctively he soothed. How completely he made space for them. She caught him once in the early morning light, his shirt wrinkled, his hair a mess, and both girls asleep on his chest. One hand cradled Isla's head. The other stroked Elodie's back in slow circles. He looked up when she entered, his voice barely above a breath. I didn't know I had this much love inside me. Her heart ached and bloomed all at once. Neither did I. Weeks passed. The house learned a new soundscape. Soft whimpers, rhythmic breathing, lullabies sung half asleep, the shuffle of Naomi's slippers across the hallway floor. One evening, when the twins had finally settled into their bassinets, the rooms were quiet, and the sky outside had turned a deep navy blue. Thomas wheeled into the kitchen, carrying something small. Naomi looked up from the sink. What's that? He set the box on the table and opened it. Inside was a delicate gold necklace. 2 small rings interlocked at the center. One is engraved with I, and the other is with E. Isla, Elodie. And beside them, a third plain, smooth, unmarked. He looked up. One for you, one for them, one for everything that's still ahead. Naomi didn't speak. Her throat was too tight. He fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing the hollow of her throat, his lips pressing a kiss just above the chain. And as she leaned into him, this man she had never planned on, this life she had never dared imagine, Naomi understood something that hadn't been clear until now. Love wasn't built in declarations or grand moments. It was here, in the small, patient acts of showing up, in holding hands through pain, in 3 tiny rings, warm against her skin, in the weight of 2 daughters, breathing beside them. By late May, the world had softened. The garden outside the Whitaker estate bloomed in complete relief. Tulips gave way to lilies. The air held the perfume of early summer, and the sky stayed open longer, like it too had grown reluctant to close its eyes. Inside the house, the days moved in a rhythm so subtle, Naomi barely noticed it shifting. Diaper changes blurred into lullabies, nap times into warm afternoon feedings. Isla liked to be held upright against the shoulder, always alert, always needing to see the room. Elodie preferred to sleep curled into the crook of Naomi's elbow, as if her dreams came easier that way. Sometimes, Naomi forgot she used to live in silence. She would catch herself humming, bouncing slightly on her toes in the hallway without thinking. A bottle balanced in one hand, a pacifier in the other. The robe she wore most days smelled like milk and lavender oil. Her curls lived in a loose knot, and her once perfect sketchbooks now held pages decorated with baby spit and tiny fingerprints. And still, somewhat, she had never felt more whole. One evening, as dusk slid quietly into the windows, Naomi stood barefoot in the nursery, watching the twins sleep. Thomas wheeled in behind her, silent as a shadow. He didn't say anything at first, just rested a hand on her back. "They're growing fast," he whispered, as though any louder might wake the peace. Naomi nodded. I blinked, and their faces changed. "They have your mouth," he said. "And your patience," she added with a small smile. "Or at least Elodie does." Thomas chuckled under his breath. "Then Isla is my temper." Naomi turned to him, rested her head lightly against his. "They're a little of both of us. That's the miracle, isn't it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze lingered on the bassinets, and his voice was lower than usual when he finally spoke. More uncertain. "Do you ever wonder if this is temporary?" he asked. "Like it's too good to stay?" She pulled back slightly, enough to see his face. You mean us? I mean, all of it. He gestured vaguely around the room. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. Naomi studied him. That's not fear talking, Thomas. That's grief. You've learned to expect loss. He looked down. She cupped his jaw gently. But you're allowed to stay happy. You're allowed to let something good last. His throat worked. I didn't think I'd be here. I didn't think I'd be a father. Or someone like you would want to share all this with me. Naomi smiled. Tender. Patient. I didn't think I'd be here either. But here we are. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his temple. A small kiss. A vow without ceremony. Later that night, after the twins had settled and the house had gone still, Thomas found Naomi in the den, curled up on the couch with her sketchbook open and a pencil smudging soft lines across the page. He didn't interrupt her, just wheeled to the edge of the rug and watched. After a few moments, she looked up. You're staring, she teased, though her voice was warm. Can I see? She turned the book slowly. The drawing was unfinished. Soft, graphite lines, graceful curves. But it was unmistakable. It was a portrait. Of him. Not posed, not polished. Just him. Head tilted slightly downward, gaze focused, jaw gentle with thought. A small crease between his brows only appeared when he didn't know someone was watching. It captured the quiet gravity of him. Not the CEO. Not the man in the chair. Just Thomas. He didn't speak. Naomi's voice softened. I wanted to remember you like this. He blinked. Why? Because this is the version of you the world doesn't get to see. Thomas swallowed hard. He looked at her like she'd just given him something he hadn't known he'd needed. I want you to have a space to create again, he said quietly. Something just for you. She shook her head gently. This is for me. You. The girls. It's all one thing now. No, he said. You deserve something that isn't always tied to someone else. Naomi tilted her head, considering. Are you offering me a room? I'm offering you a studio, he said. Big windows, natural light, silence when you want it, noise when you don't. A space to breathe. She smiled. I'll take it, but only if you promise to interrupt me with snacks. He laughed. Done. The sunroom just off the eastern wing was transformed in the following days. The furniture was moved, and the walls were painted soft gray. An old drafting table was brought in, angled perfectly beneath the light. Potted plants lined the windowsill. Her favorite pencils were arranged in color-coded tins. Naomi stepped into it the first morning and cried. Not because it was extravagant, but because it was a kind of permission. A quiet way of saying, you still belong to yourself. She began drawing again, not professionally, not for anyone but herself. Sketches of motherhood, of fatigue, of joy that didn't need explanation. Pages filled with unfiltered emotion, equal parts messy and breathtaking. One night, as the twins slept soundly and the rain tapped against the glass in rhythmic intervals, Naomi sat at her new desk, hair damp from a bath, wrapped in one of Thomas's shirts. She was working on a new piece, two tiny hands, reaching in opposite directions, but touching at the fingertips. Thomas wheeled in behind her, holding 2 mugs of tea. He set one beside her and kissed the top of her head. She turned toward him. Do you think they'll remember any of this? He glanced toward the nursery. Probably not. Then why does it matter so much? He smiled faintly. Because we'll remember. And that will shape the way we love them. Naomi's heart ached with something sweet and sharp. She reached for his hand, held it tightly. And in that moment, Amid the quiet, the sketches, the rain, they didn't need anything more. No declarations, no endings, just presence, and the steady knowledge that they had already begun building a life with enough softness to carry the hard days, and enough quiet to make room for every word that hadn't been said yet. There was a rhythm to things now. Morning sunlight threaded itself through the linen curtains, soft and golden. The twins usually woke just past 6, one a beat ahead of the other, as if they took turns announcing the day. Naomi would rise first, her robe tied hastily, her feet knowing the path to the nursery in the dark. Thomas met her there most days, his chair gliding silently down the hall, hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep, but never missing the smallest cry. He had become a quiet expert in the routines of fatherhood, warming bottles to the right temperature, tucking swaddles with precision, and humming nonsense lullabies in his low, steady baritone until both girls settled again. Naomi watched him sometimes, not as a partner or a father, but as a man she had once only known in fragments, a man who now shared the weight of this tiny world with her, equally. It still surprised her how easily they worked together, how quickly they began anticipating each other's thoughts. She didn't have to ask anymore. He knew she needed 10 minutes alone in the shower, when her back ached in that particular spot, when she hadn't had a complete meal in hours. And in return, she knew when the silence in his eyes meant more than exhaustion, when something beneath the surface had unsettled him. Those days, she brought him coffee without asking how he wanted it, or left the girls with the night nurse so they could sit on the back porch together and just be. No expectations, no explanations, just the comfort of breath and stillness and mutual presence. One night, well past midnight, Naomi couldn't sleep. The house had gone quiet. The girls had gone down early for once, and the moonlight spilled over the hardwood floors in long, silvery lines. She rose from bed, careful not to wake Thomas, and went down the hallway, bare feet cold against the floor. She found herself in the nursery again. There, in the low light, 2 bassinets sat side by side. She leaned over each, brushing a fingertip gently across Isla's tiny knuckles, then Elodie's soft cheek. The sight of them, so small, so impossibly real, filled her chest with something wordless. She didn't hear Thomas until his chair rolled softly behind her. "You okay?" She turned. Couldn't sleep. He moved closer. "Are they all right?" She nodded. "Perfect." They stood there silently for a while, watching over the daughters that had once been just flickers on a sonogram. Then, quietly, she said, "Sometimes I look at them and wonder who they'll be." Thomas's voice was low. "What do you imagine?" Naomi folded her arms across her chest, her expression thoughtful. "I imagine one of them will be louder, braver, maybe. The kind of girl who runs before she walks. The other, she'll be gentler, but just as strong. The kind of girl who listens more than she speaks." Thomas smiled. "You think they'll be that different?" "They already are." He nodded, and for a long time, they stood there, absorbing it all. The weight, the wonder, the quiet hum of a life that neither of them had planned for, but now couldn't imagine walking away from. "I've been thinking," he said eventually. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "That always sounds like the start of a negotiation." Thomas gave her a crooked smile. "Maybe." He turned slightly, gesturing down the hallway. "Come with me." She followed him, barefoot and curious, into the guest room that had once been hers. Inside, everything had changed. The furniture was gone. In its place stood a large white oak table near the window, soft lighting strung along the molding, bookshelves lined with sketch pads and art books, a new easel resting near a corner filled with pillows. Naomi's breath caught. Thomas. He looked at her, cautious. It's your space now. Not just for drawing, for dreaming, for whatever part of yourself you've been putting last. Her eyes shimmered. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. She stepped inside, trailing her fingers across the edge of the table, then over the spines of the books. Everything about the room felt intentional, thoughtful, quietly hers. She turned to him. You built me a studio. I built you a sanctuary, he corrected. She returned to him, stood between his knees, and gently touched his shoulders. Why do you do this? She asked. Because you stayed, he said. When you didn't have to. When I gave you every reason not to. Naomi leaned down, her forehead resting against his. I didn't stay for charity. I know. She cupped his face, her voice barely a whisper. I stayed because I didn't want to spend another minute wondering what it would have felt like to be seen like this. His hands found her waist, anchoring her. You are, he said. Seen, completely. They kissed then, not like new lovers, not like people desperate for the physical, but like those who had lived long enough to know that intimacy starts in the quietest moments. The everyday ones, the ones where no one else is looking. Later that week, Thomas surprised her again, not with flowers or jewelry, but with a simple envelope. She found it on the kitchen counter, after a long afternoon spent sketching while the twins napped. Her name was written in ink on the front. She opened it slowly. Inside, a card. You, me, Isla, Elodie. Under the chandeliers where it all began. Wear white if you feel like it. Naomi stared at the card for a long time. The hotel lounge, where she'd first seen him sitting alone by the window, where she'd asked to share his quiet, where they'd danced without dancing, where her life had turned before she even knew it had shifted. She pressed the card to her chest, not because of what it promised, but because of what it remembered. When she looked up, Thomas was in the doorway, watching her. You want this? She asked, voice trembling. He didn't hesitate. I want to marry you, not because we have to, but because I can't imagine waking up to anyone else. Naomi's lips curved into the softest smile. Then you'd better be ready to hear my vows. He reached for her hand. I've been ready since you didn't look away. And in that kitchen, with the late light slanting golden across the floor and the scent of chamomile steeping in the air, Naomi realized something she hadn't dared believe before. This wasn't just the life she'd stepped into. It was the one she'd chosen, and it had chosen her right back. The hotel lounge had changed. It was no longer just a place where strangers crossed paths, but a sanctuary for two souls who had weathered storms and found calm in each other. The soft jazz that once whispered through the air filled the room with the rich warmth of a familiar embrace. Thomas waited near the window, dressed in a tailored navy suit that fit him like a second skin, a single rose pinned to his lapel. His eyes held the same steel blue calm, but now they sparkled with something more profound. Hope, resolve, and a quiet joy that hadn't been there before. Naomi entered slowly, the hem of her white dress barely brushing the marble floor. Her curls cascaded freely over her shoulders, framing a face that glowed with nerves and certainty. In her arms rested Isla and Elodie, who swaddled gently and slept peacefully. She met Thomas's gaze across the room, and the years of uncertainty melted away instantly. They were no longer two people unsure of the path ahead, but partners standing at the threshold of a new beginning. The room held its breath as Thomas stepped forward, taking Naomi's hand. No audience, he said softly. No grand stage. Just us. Naomi nodded, the quiet strength in his voice steadying her. He cleared his throat, voice warm and steady. Arya, he began. her name a sacred echo in the stillness. You changed the way I breathe. You taught me that strength isn't about holding everything inside, but letting someone in. You are my calm, my compass, my home. He paused, his eyes searching hers. I vow to love you fiercely, even on the hard days, especially on the hard days. Naomi felt tears prick her eyes, but she held them back, letting his words wash over her like a gentle tide. When you walked into my life, I had nothing but questions. You gave me answers I didn't know I needed. You gave me peace. His voice broke slightly, raw with emotion. When I gave you my heart, you held it gently. You never made me feel like too much or not enough. Naomi reached up, cupping his cheek with trembling hands. I vow to keep choosing you, every day, even when life gets messy, even when sleep is a luxury, even when our daughters grow and forget how small they once were. I'll still be standing beside you. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of every promise they'd made, spoken and unspoken. Thomas smiled, holding all the storms and sunshine of their journey. They kissed then, not for show, not for anyone else, but for the quiet love that had bloomed between them. Later that evening, with the twins asleep in their cribs, Thomas and Naomi swayed slowly in the soft glow of their bedroom. No music played, but their hearts beat in perfect rhythm. Naomi rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady strength of his arms around her. Do you ever regret it? She asked softly. Not for a second, he replied. Not even that first night? He kissed her forehead gently. That night gave me everything. They stood wrapped in silence, wrapped in each other, wrapped in the family they never planned, but always needed. Their story hadn't begun with certainty. It hadn't followed a plan. It began in shadows carved from loneliness, fear, and unexpected grace. But now, it was theirs, and it would never end. The night wrapped around them like a gentle whisper. Naomi and Thomas stood together in their bedroom, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting golden hues over the worn pages of a book left open on the nightstand. The twins were finally asleep, their quiet breaths a steady rhythm that filled the house with life and promise. The world outside faded for a moment. No deadlines, past regrets, or whispered doubts. There was only this. Thomas looked at Naomi, tracing the curve of her jaw with eyes that held both wonder and deep familiarity. You know, he said softly, I used to think that love was supposed to knock, that it had to announce itself with thunder. Naomi smiled, leaning into his warmth. But sometimes, he continued, love doesn't knock. It crashes in when you least expect it. Flawed, inconvenient, perfect in its way. She wrapped her arms around him, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. Their journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of fear and silence heavier than any spoken word. Moments when the future seemed too vast, uncertain, and fragile to hold on to. But they had chosen each other, again and again. In the quiet mornings filled with soft lullabies, in the endless nights of whispered names and gentle touches, the laughter that echoed through their home carried on tiny, unsteady footsteps. Naomi rested her head against Thomas's chest, listening to the sound that had become her favorite melody. He kissed the top of her head. Thank you for staying, he murmured, for choosing us. She smiled, eyes glistening with unshed tears, for choosing me. Together they stood there, two imperfect souls who had found home not in grand gestures, but in the everyday moments that stitched their lives into one. As the moonlight spilled across the floor, casting long shadows that danced with their silhouettes. Naomi whispered, "This is where I belong." And Thomas held her tighter, knowing they had built something unbreakable, no matter what storms came their way. A love that didn't just survive, but thrived. In the quiet, in the ordinary, in the extraordinary grace of simply being together. And in that embrace, beneath the watchful stars, their story became a testament that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones we never see coming. The sun rose gently over Boston, painting the sky in soft strokes of pink and gold, as if the world wanted to honor the quiet miracle unfolding inside the Whitaker estate. Naomi woke to the warmth of Thomas's arms wrapped protectively around her, the steady rise and fall of his breath syncing perfectly with the constant thump of their daughter's heartbeats inside her. For a moment, she lay still, eyes closed, letting the comfort of the morning seep into her bones. Their journey had been anything but ordinary. A chance meeting in a snowy hotel lounge had blossomed into a lifetime neither had imagined. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of fragile hope, but also moments of breathtaking tenderness, unwavering commitment, and love so deep it reshaped every part of them. Together, they had crafted a home not defined by walls or wealth, but by the steady rhythm of shared breaths, soft lullabies, and the quiet courage to trust in something new. Naomi opened her eyes to find Thomas watching her, his expression a mixture of love and awe, as if seeing her anew with every glance. "I love you," he whispered. She smiled, fingers tracing the lines of his face. "And I love you," she replied. Their daughters stirred softly in the next room, the perfect heartbeat of their life together. Outside, the city pulsed with its steady rhythm, but inside their sanctuary, time felt infinite, each moment a precious gift. Naomi sat up, looking around the room filled with memories and promises, and felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected path that had led her here. She thought of the snowy night, the whispered dance, the whispered vows, and the love that had crashed quietly, flawed, inconvenient, and perfect in every way. This was not the story she had planned, but it was the one she would choose every time. Because love, true love, is never about perfection. It's about resilience, about finding grace in the broken places, about choosing each other again, even when the world outside is uncertain. As the morning light streamed through the window, Naomi stood and looked out at the horizon, at a future still unwritten, but full of hope. She knew challenges would come. There would be days when fatigue weighed heavily, doubts whispered louder, and life demanded more than they thought they could give. But she also knew they would face it all, hand in hand, heart to heart, because they had built something unbreakable. A family forged not just by fate, but by the quiet strength of two souls who refused to give up on each other. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in the unexpected ways love finds us, please like and share this journey. Leave your thoughts below. What part spoke to you the most? Your story matters here. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales that heal, inspire, and remind us all that sometimes the best love stories are the ones we never saw coming. Thank you for being part of this journey. The story continues, with every breath, every heartbeat, every moment shared.